I am so happy to be here. This has been so great. I really loved the way you guys shared earlier this evening before dinner, talking about yourselves and about your business ideas. So much passion and energy. It's so exciting. And the stories from dinner time were terrific as well. And I think I'm going to tell a story as well about a business that I'm familiar with that you might see some elements of your future in. And I think you find some really interesting connecting points. And hopefully in the hour or so after this talk, or after this presentation, I'll give you a little bit of sort of background on where I think all those connecting points can go, and hopefully leave you with some thoughts about how that can connect to your ideas around your business and where you're going. Maybe just a second about me. I come from a small town in upstate New York, so I can relate to small town life. My family's still there. I'm not, so I can relate to a lot of elements of small town life. And there's a lot of similarities. I can find them. I started started professional life as an engineer, and worked in a Fortune 500 aerospace type company in the U.S. and Europe and Asia, and worked my way up through that organization and learned a ton through that about how big business works and how you can go really in product development cycles from the idea of a product, from a technology to a product, to a business plan, to a successful outcome, or not. Learn from our mistakes too. So next chapter of my career, I worked in the renewable energy industry for a really small company. Literally, it was a two-bay garage operation in Seattle. And it was a power electronics company, so we manufactured power electronics. And that was an amazing experience as well. Again, starting from a really small organization, we had some success, and it was the right time to be in the renewable energy industry, especially around distributed generation. And we actually ended up having a pretty successful IPO at the end of that, which was a really interesting chapter of my career and of my experience. But you know, early in my experience there, we were really about the mission of driving a change in behavior and enabling renewable energy for the masses. Towards the end of my experience there, we were really interested in making money and having a successful IPO and working with venture capitalists and mezzanine financing and eventually I kind of came to the conclusion after detox, after that whole experience, I came to the conclusion that the more you pay attention to the dollars, the less the business makes sense. And it was at that time I started my own consulting practice, so back to doing my own thing in the renewable energy space again. And I did a graduate degree in sustainability at the Bainbridge Graduate Institute, which had just launched at that time. I learned a ton about the background, the history, the body of work in the academic space around sustainability and around sustainable business thinking. And I thought a lot about how to apply that to business. And after graduating, I had this incredible opportunity in 2005 to join REI. The co-op was just starting its sustainability efforts at that time. And I had the wonderful opportunity working with Sally Jewell and the leadership team and others there to move that business from, as she called it, random acts of kindness to a sustainable business strategy, and really uncover an awful lot of the ways in which businesses can really be part of the solution in a really powerful way. And so that was my chapter, and I left there earlier this year. Sally got a new job, and some of you have heard. She's now working for the administration as the new Secretary of the Interior. And it was a wonderful opportunity to start to take a next chapter. So as I've looked back and I've had the chance to do a little bit of writing, I've blogged a little bit about it, done some articles and done some publishing about what I learned in that process. In fact, there's a series called What I Learned About Sustainability at REI, and please feel free to go check it out at kevinhagencsr.org. And the point of that series is really to share some of these stories and share some of this way of thinking, I hope, with folks who don't have to make the same mistakes I did, or we did, but can actually use that information to their advantage. So, I have the unenviable after-dinner section of the boot camp. Yeah. So, we're going to talk a little bit about this story about farm power, and then talk about 45 minutes or so about sustainable business in general and some of the lessons, I think, of how that translates to an entrepreneurial environment. And then we're going to do an exercise after that, and then I'm not in between you and whatever you really wanted to do this evening. And then we have more time tomorrow and in a couple of different sessions. So I'll have a chance you can answer questions or we can sort of look at one-on-one issues of your particular ideas or where you want to go with it or ask questions about something that didn't make sense tonight. So with that, let me introduce you to Daryl and Kevin Moss. Daryl and Kevin are really, really cool people. I met Kevin because he was also a student at the Bainbridge Graduate Institute. And he went to the Bainbridge Graduate Institute with a neat idea. He wanted his MBA, and during his MBA time, he wanted to work on his business plan. He's a budding entrepreneur, and wanted to start work on his, had this really interesting idea about how to help dairy farmers. They grew up in the Skagit Valley of Washington State, just north of Seattle, around Mount Vernon area of Washington. And they had this pretty neat idea for a business. And so through his 2 years, about 2 years at BGI, he worked with a team of people and others and exercised his business plan, threw it out, wrote it again, threw it out, wrote it again. You'll get that. You'll get the hang of that soon. And morphed his idea into what eventually launched as this story of farm power. I wanted to share this story because I think it has something to offer all of us as we look at this new thinking about how to look at a business proposition in a new way. And I'm going to shuttle back and forth to do, there we go. So the dairy business in the Skagit Valley, there's 3 things that dairy farmers spend a lot of time thinking about. The first is feeding cows. The second is milking cows. And the third is, you guessed it, the other end of the cow. So I'm trying to figure out how to move appropriately so that I don't block your view the whole time. She gets to capture the film and I get to push the button. So forgive me for the, well, they called it, I wasn't going to dance tonight after all. So the dairy business has these 3 pretty important components. The dairy business as a whole is pretty interesting. In fact, this diagram starts to talk about what the dairy cycle looks like, or the business circle. Now already, farmers have a leg up on the rest of us business folks because the rest of us business folks talk about value chains. We think about linear progression, and I'll talk about that in the discussion, but most of us think about the business in a linear chain of take, make, waste, frankly. Dairy folks already know that it's a circle, and they already know that from the one end of the cow, they end up with fertilizer for the other end of the cow because they get to grow crops in the middle and they maintain nutrient flows with their crops. Unfortunately, there are some disadvantages to the way this works out, especially as animal density starts to go up on the land. You end up with some challenges. For example, the manure produces a lot of methane. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, if that's a concern to you. In fact, it's more than 20 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas than CO2, than carbon dioxide. If you've ever been in dairy country, dairy air is odor issues occasionally. And finally, there's issues of water quality because the nutrients run off the land. When you just throw it back out on the land, the nutrients run off, and if you have the wrong time of year or the wrong density or the wrong things going on, you can put a lot of nutrients into the water supply and end up contaminating rivers and lakes near the farms. So these are some challenges with all dairy. And, you know, frankly, historically speaking, what we really tend to do is we kind of think of those as trade-offs. And we kind of say, well, you know, there's some breakage. There's really good things. You like milk, don't you? And we like dairy farmers. And, well, there's some trade-offs. So there's these negative things that happen. Compare those to the positive things that happen. And it's about trade-offs, right? So responsible businesses simply make better balancing decisions, make better trade-offs, right? Well, it doesn't have to be that way. And in fact, there's this really neat technology called digesters. Anybody live in a septic tank? That happens a lot. No, nobody has a septic tank at home? All right. So a dairy digester is a really big septic tank with one little caveat, and that is that it's anaerobic, so it keeps oxygen out. It makes all the processing. The microbes attack the manure in a oxygen-free environment. that actually causes a different kind of reaction, and the byproduct is methane. Actually more methane than you ever imagined. It produces a huge amount of methane. And if you capture that methane and pipe it off, you could burn it in, for example, a generator and make electricity. Net, you actually destroy more methane than you would have had in the first place, so it actually comes out to be quite an advantage. And when you're finished with the digester, you can recapture all the nutrients. They're actually a little better processed, so you can actually put them on the ground a little better. You can separate the liquid from the solids. The solids can become a product themselves. In fact, if you dry them right, they can go back in the barn and actually be bedding for the cows. Because they've been through this process, they've been hot for so long, they're actually pathogen-free. So there's a huge amount of benefits to putting a dairy digester in this circuit. And in fact, this diagram starts to show all the new revenue streams that can be generated. And in fact, some new revenue streams that no one's ever thought of. For example, since it's actually destroying more more greenhouse gas emissions than would have happened normally, you can actually sell carbon credits. Who knew? You can actually create this new product of carbon credits. You can actually get some tax credits because the Ag Department and others have created incentives to do this. And you can create this fiber I mentioned. One more interesting product, you can actually take byproducts of other ag industries, for example, the byproducts of fish plants and all the stuff that you would have had to landfill, and you can put it in this thing. Not only does that provide more revenue because they pay you to do that, but in fact, it produces even more methane, so it makes the whole system even more effective. Wow, a lot of really cool things about that. Unfortunately, even the digester folks have come to recognize that there's an unintended consequence. And one of the things we're going to talk about in the rest of this conversation is if you have if you have a less than full view of the sustainability model, you can chase something that looks really green but has unfortunate consequences later down the road. And in fact, this is one of them. So what could be wrong with a dairy digester? It sounded so good, right? Well, one of the challenges is that small-time farms, in fact, I'll confess, that's my family farm. That's my cousin and his wife and his kids. It's dated. The little guy on the far right is now the senior center linebacker for the Cornell football team. Leads the team in tackles, doing great. When we meet at Thanksgiving, I sit where he gives me permission to sit. But the challenge is that small farms are really disadvantaged by the digester industry, because the digester industry really needs a critical mass in order to kind of justify building one. You got to have enough cows, you got to have enough money, you got to have enough of the EPA problems, and you got to have enough profits, because a lot of the credits are in tax credits. Well, if you don't make enough money, tax credits don't do much for you, right? And you have to have a lot of savvy, and you have to have a lot of capacity, because when you're feeding cows, milking cows, and cleaning up after cows, when do you run the digester, right? So unfortunately, when your farm looks like this, instead of like that, you're actually more likely to use a digester and actually need one and be able to pay for one. Unfortunately, and they look, by the way, like this. They're big when they do it that way. The downside is that this green technology actually has this unfortunate social side consequence of actually making the big guys even more competitive and making the little guys even more disadvantaged in this scenario. Wow, that didn't work out quite as green as we were planning. Right? So, wow, what happened there? So along comes Kevin and Daryl, and they go, you know, there's nothing wrong with this digester technology. It's the business plan. It's the business mechanism that's the problem. The technology's there, the product's there, but man, this business plan of only selling these things to the really big guys is a problem. So they started to rethink how you could use this technology to the advantage of small farms in a new business model. And so the innovation here wasn't in the technology, it wasn't in the product, it was in the how. Did they do this and how do they implement this? And the way they did it is really clever. They're from the Skagit Valley. They went to high school with all the dairy farmers, and their friends were just about coming of age when they were taking over the farms from their families. They're all looking at each other going, gee, we want to stay small, or at least, the scale that's appropriate for this area, but we're getting killed in all these different ways, including not having a chance to manage manure in a new technology. That's actually the Skagit River, if you can kind of get the bend there. And there's two farms, one up in the corner and one down here. So they said, you know what? There are perfect locations where even though one farm doesn't have enough cows, 2 or 3 farms do have enough cows, but how would we build a model to make that work? And so they invented Farm Power, and Farm Power's business plan is to find these sweet spot locations. And in fact, in this case, it happens to be, well, it doesn't show up very good, but there's a star right between those 2 farms. And what they did was they located that, found that location. They created an entire business model where they rent the manure from each farm, pump it into a central digester. They send back the liquid effluent to this farm, so they maintain their nutrients. But they get to process in the middle, and so they get to make green energy, they get the tax credits. These guys own and operate, under these operating agreements, this location where it's basically a co-op of guys getting together to build a digester. They were super successful in their first one, and in fact, they've now got 5. 2 in the Skagit, well, one in Skagit Valley, one up in Whatcom County, right along the Canadian border, one down in King County of Washington, and 2 down in Tillamook, Oregon. And they've now got 5 systems fully operational in a really neat business model that's being very effective. So this model is really one of the keys to why this worked. Farm Power didn't think of themselves as part of a chain. They started to look at themselves as part of a network, part of an ecosystem, if you will. Started to say, what are all the relationships around this spot that make this business successful? Start to think about all the people involved. And so I don't expect you to read that, but the top one is the dairy farms itself, and there's this interesting loop of relationship where I buy the manure from you and I sell the nutrients back to you for a cost. In the interim, you have all these other interesting players, from the utility company who's buying the green energy, to the farm supply co-op who's selling them a truck, to the banking folks, to government, to local investors, to other organic farms that are buying extra effluent or extra nutrients from the process, ag waste producers, the local chicken parts guy, the local fish parts guy, in the right season when the potatoes are being harvested, there's lots of parts of potatoes that nobody uses. It all goes in the digester for a fee. And guess what the fee is? $1 less than it was going to cost you to dump it anyplace else. Okay, $2 less. Well, we'll be a tough negotiator. So this is really an interesting model because it starts to make us think about what's the ecosystem of the business instead of just what's the relationship of my customer and my vendors. It starts to think about all the people around us. And in fact, when you start to think about this in a new way, you start to think about all the people who can become winners because this business is successful. And when you start to think about that, you start to think about stakeholders who have a vested interest, who become proponents, part of the prosperacy, if you will, of making your business successful. And I think that's a real key to a new way of thinking about business, and one of the skill sets that I think is important. So some of the keys to the game, so I got to go over here and do this. So some of the keys to the game of being successful at this. First, challenging the way it is. You know, we had to, as my grandfather used to say, when he looked at problems of these trade-offs, he would say, you got to break some eggs to make cake. Well, what if you didn't have to break the eggs in the first place? What if you thought of a different way to do the project or the business plan that didn't break those eggs? Secondly, a lot of the sustainable business movement has spent a lot of time thinking about how to do less bad. Let's recycle, let's make less greenhouse gases, let's use less fuel, etc. all of those are good things we should think about, and many of them can be very financially viable, but a lot of times we're thinking about ways to make our business less bad. And ultimately, being less bad is not the same as being good. Right? So we have to start making a shift in sustainable business thinking from ways in which we're going to be less bad to ways in which we actually create environmental and social benefits while we're making a profit. Finally, thinking in systems, this win-win-win. How many people can win from this decision? And that network of thinking was an important way to think about that. Thinking in value propositions. So all these stakeholders have a value proposition, and I use the quickie handle, the WIFM. What's the WIFM? Which stands for, what's in it for me? So if you can think of other people's WIFM for what you want to do, that's a value proposition. The lessons of unintended consequences. We have to have a holistic view of how we're looking at environmental and social responsibility across the business. We have to have a pretty big view in order to make sure that 2 steps down the road we don't end up with unfortunate substitutions or negative unintended consequences. Sometimes this requires some new metrics. Who thought that counting carbon would actually be worth something? Well, in Kevin and Daryl's business, counting carbon is making money, because they're selling those carbon credits to people who actually are buying them for real money. And so figuring out how to count carbon was something that, frankly, that's new. We don't know how to do that very well. And so some of the new metrics of business are actually becoming part of the keys to the game. And finally, sustainability really is the mother of an invention. It's just holding ourselves to a new standard of performance is actually a whole new motivation and inspiration for innovative ways to do things, not only in the product, not only in the operations of the business, but in the very value proposition of the business, just like these guys did. So let me reintroduce Kevin and Daryl Moss. A few years ago, Kevin was a Russian language major. Actually, I think it was Russian history major, who'd just gotten back from teaching in Russia, teaching English as a second language in Russia. Very rewarding, not particularly lucrative. That was Kevin. Daryl just retired as a captain in the Air Force and was bringing his young family back from Texas and looking for a way to support them in the Skagit Valley and trying to find jobs in the Skagit Valley. The two of them looked at each other and said, well, what if we work for no money for 24/7 for 3 years really hard and don't, basically overcome every possible obstacle? Okay, that's not what they said. What they said was, hey, let's start our own business. Today on paper they're millionaires, and they're doing terrific because they've created a value proposition that's a whole different way of looking at solving problems in their community. It's created jobs. It's actually created really good jobs for diesel mechanics and high-level folks. It's really added to the livelihoods and the sustainability of local dairy farms, of farm-scale dairy farms. And it's created a tremendous amount of environmental benefits, reduced in EPA compliance issues with runoff, better water quality in the Skagit Valley. It's created byproducts of nutrient-rich soil amendments for organic farms and bedding for farmers. All these amazing benefits have accrued because they thought of a different way to solve the problem. And I think it's a really terrific example of the next generation of how we're thinking about solving environmental problems, solving social problems, and doing it from a point of view of using the enterprise as the engine to accomplish that. So that's the story of Farm Power. What I'm going to do next is figure out how to get my other presentation up. So don't look at the guy behind the curtain. It's substantial because they have 5 dairy digesters that are operating, and they produce enough cash flow to pay for their loans, and they produce enough cash flow to run the business and to pay their employees and to pay them. And as soon as the loans go down, the cash flow increases. It's the free cash flow.
Selling is electricity.
About 50% of their income comes from selling electricity. That's right.
Okay, so they're selling methane.
No, they burn the methane
They burn
in a
it, so
generator on
they're
site.
actually producing
The electricity.
the electricity. So,
Yep.
okay.
Yep, they capture the methane in the machine, in the box, burn the methane in a generator, that makes the electricity. It also has waste heat. So guess what? The second one they built, they partnered with a greenhouse operation next door. So they even sold the waste heat. Somebody wants to raise pigs. My grandfather raised pigs for a long time, and he used to say, what I like about this business is, the great thing about raising a pig is you eat everything but the squeal.
Hi, you phrased this in an interesting way early on, and I wrote it down. You said that they rented the manure and sold it back.
Yeah.
Now, could you use different language? I mean, like,
We borrow the manure and give it back to them.
But it wasn't a cooperative? You wouldn't say this was a cooperative?
Well, cooperative is an actual legal structure.
Right.
So it's a cooperating activity.
Yeah.
And the farmers are cooperating because they're pumping the manure one way,
Right.
pumping the liquid back on the fields the other. And what would be the first concern of the farmers is to make sure that all the nutrients that went into the machine, they get back, because they bought all those nutrients as fertilizer. That's
Okay,
right.
so really they're selling fertilizer and they're generating electricity. There's two.
And they're selling carbon credits,
Okay.
and they're selling soil amendment,
They're very,
and they're getting tipping fees. And there's about 6 different revenue streams to this business. Yeah.
I mean, what's the transportation?
Pumpable distance is important.
So
Yeah.
which is why they have 5, to keep it localized.
Because, well, it's one of the reasons there's only 5, because there's only certain spots that you can be right perfectly located between farms that are of the right size to be able to pump the manure.
So when they pump it, they muck it all over to a spot where the tube is, and then
Yeah, the barns clear into a pump. The barns typically manage the manure by pumping anyway, so it's just pumping from the farm to a further location. Manure management 101. Who could be? Yeah, one more question here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just curious, like operationally, like how many people are involved in the aspect of accounting for all of these different
Flow meters, it's all automated.
Really?
Yeah. Yep.
So it doesn't really.
Yep.
it's not
Daryl
like-
actually runs 5 digesters from his office in his house with screens up, watching all the metrics of all of them. So I'm going to move on, because the story of Farm Power is really cool, and I really like those guys, and I really like what they've done. But I wanted to use it as an illustration, because I think that it marks many of the points along the way that really show this shift of what sustainable business thinking is all about. So what I thought I'd do is spend a little time on that from the big picture point of view. So my agenda for the rest of this is starting with the big picture. I want to start with a little bit of background and a little bit of sort of, bear with me for a little bit of philosophical position, because I think you need the right sort of mental state, the right philosophical position to be able to get down to the tactics of how we're going to apply that. But we're not going to spend all day on that. Wait, I'll tell you the rest of the story. So then, how is this impacting businesses at large? And ultimately, how can this add value to you, and how can you use this from an entrepreneurial perspective? So let me talk a little bit about the big picture. Put in some would say a bit of a negative context, just to make the point. Conventional thinking about business tends to be pretty linear. We tend to think about take, make, and waste. And yes, someplace in there, somebody made some money. In fact, I even illustrated that in the illustration. There we go. We're making money along the way. However, and of course, there was somebody in between make and waste. Somebody loved it. It was this shirt. It was my puppy, my puppy doll. It was my refrigerator that I love. It was my car. It was something that I love. And then I wasted it. And I pretty much threw it away when I was done. And if you look at the total life of the object, the part where I loved it, it's really short in the total life of where this was. So unfortunately, this has been good. This has been a good run. We've used this technology for about 100 years or so. It's been a good run. Unfortunately, we're starting to catch up with us. We're starting to realize that the world just isn't that big. Everybody's got a cell phone, and there's a lot of people with cell phones now. They're telling me all about what's going on in other parts of the world, and starting to realize that, when I throw something away, I don't know where away is. In fact, there is no such place as away. Every place is someplace. And all of a sudden we find ourselves throwing stuff over the wall to the next person's yard, to the next person's yard. So the world got a lot smaller on us. It got a lot more connected. We got a lot smarter. And all of a sudden, the take, make, waste approach to doing things just isn't cutting it anymore. So what's next? What's cool about this, I think, and what a shift, hopefully you'll find a shift in my presentation and my thinking about this, and the way sustainable business folks are starting to think about this, versus maybe how an environmentalist might have thought about it. I think we've spent a lot of time up till now telling folks that we're all going to die. That's not helpful. In fact, when I feel like I'm part of the problem, and I'm just part of the problem, then I only really have two places to go. I can go to denial, or I can go to despair. What we really need is hope. And I think that for too long we've had the I have a nightmare speech. So tonight, hopefully, you get a little bit of I have a dream speech, because that I can get around, right? The hope I can get to. And I think the place where business comes in is very much in the I have a dream space. I think business can be a wonderful solution to this. In fact, Paul Hawkins, who wrote The Ecology of Commerce and many other works, a seminal thinker in this whole space, and a darling of the environmental movement, has said that only business is the only human institution with enough speed, enough resources, and enough scope to make a big enough difference fast enough. Even he says that enterprise is the engine that can make this happen. And I believe that's true. But we're going to have to do a few things different in order to make that happen, starting with our fundamental thinking from conventional thinking point of view. We're all pretty much trained that it's either or. Right? Either you make money or you do the right thing. Right? Green products are more expensive. Either or. And so we should pay more for the green products. We even think about it in our lives, right? If you really want to make a difference, you join the Peace Corps. If you want to make money, you go to the corporations, right? So it's either or. We constantly are faced with this either or paradigm. Well, if it's either or, then running a business turns into a balancing act. And frankly, I'm not good at that. I want more. I got to turn the dial. We can't have a balancing act solution. We're never going to get there if it's going to be a balancing act. If we have to live with either or, we're in bad shape. Leads us to trade-offs. Trade-offs lead us to compromise. And I don't mean to make any political jokes, but in this context, compromise just doesn't cut it. Because compromise ends up with something less on either side than what you really wanted. Right? In fact, holding the higher expectation, rejecting trade-offs, facing the impossible, and starting the conversation with that's impossible, usually means that if we really have the higher expectation, if we deliver both environmental, social, and economic returns, we actually force ourselves to innovation. Just like Kevin and Daryl did, thinking outside the box was another phrase that was used earlier. That innovation is the engine to how to do things differently, how to invent things differently. I'm making a speech to later in November, which is titled, Good News, We Have to Redesign Everything. What an opportunity. We're surrounded by insurmountable opportunity. So it starts with thinking in loops, right? We start from going from that linear way of thinking about things to thinking about it in loops. And isn't it interesting? You know, when we had a linear trajectory, there was a place where we made money at many of those transactions, right? We think about the value chain of business. We think about suppliers or manufacturers, factories, wholesalers, retailers, right? We think about those kind of blocks. And we think about everybody making some money along the way. What if it was a circle? And what if we made money all the way around the circle? What this says is there's half an economy that we're not tapping today. There's actually another whole economy as we come around the other side that we don't even have businesses for. We don't have names for those businesses yet. And we haven't really even figured out how to capture the value propositions that are really represented in all of those places. This is an enormous opportunity. People like William McDonough have called it the new industrial revolution, and I believe it. So speaking of that nice little circle, okay, it's a little more complicated than that. one model, the cradle-to-cradle model by McDonough and Baumgarten from their book Cradle to Cradle, says that there are really two important circles that we got to think about. And I'll just offer this framework for food for thought. There's really a technical nutrient cycle, and there's a biological nutrient cycle. So there's really two end states of everything. Either it goes back in the ground and we compost it, or it's a technical nutrient and you got to recover it and recapture it so that it continues to stay in a loop. Not downcycled, like a lot of our recycling is today. You know, it goes from Coke bottles to park bench to Trex to keeps going to less and less useful items. Instead, it actually comes back as the item itself, as the material. So we worked at REI on polymer recycling so that when we recycle a polyester garment, it doesn't come back as shreds and threads. We actually take it right back to groups like Taisian in Japan or Unify in Georgia, North Carolina, who actually reformulates from the waste product, they reformulate the original polymer and then refabricate new polyester. It's as good as new polyester, but didn't require any new raw material. What if we've mined everything we're ever going to need? It's all here already. All we got to do is make sure we don't throw it away, right? Or do something dumb like burn it. So the chair in the corner, that's the anybody help? Thank you. The Aeron chair from Herman Miller, which was a certified product under the cradle-to-cradle philosophy. Essentially, everything in that chair can come back apart and become its original raw material. It never has to become a chair again, but it can become nylon to make into a carpet next time. It has infinite number of life cycles because it can be taken back to the original polymer. Now, I know that's geeky, but it's hopeful because it says that we don't have to have a take, make, waste approach. We can actually keep in perpetual cycles of using the materials that we've got. And it creates incredible opportunity for businesses. Let's take a look at this business model from another perspective. Let's compete farm power against the local electric company that burns whatever to make electricity. So if that's farm power, and they're going to make their primary product electricity up on top, the competition is the local utility who's burning gas or burning coal, etc. Now, the coal required mining, so there were environmental issues on that side. It required burning. There was environmental issues there. And when you're done, there's coal ash that has to be disposed of. There's environmental issues there. So there's a business that has environmental negative consequences all along its process and appears to be low cost because we think it's low cost. Here's farm power. Farm power not only doesn't pay for their raw material, they get paid to take their raw material. If coal was free, farm power still has a lower cost of production for electricity. That's amazing, right?
Is that kind of the same concept as like biodiesel?
In some ways, sure. And I'm just looking at it straight up though from a competitive position. If the competition is a coal burning power plant and their coal was free, these guys still have a lower cost of production because they don't have a cost of production, they have an income from production. Right? They're getting paid to take their raw material in.
It seems like with trying to have this closed loop and dealing with your waste streams, you need to take the marketing of these byproducts seriously.
Absolutely.
You need to be good at marketing all these things because they don't just sell themselves.
Absolutely. And there's incumbents in every one of those markets. Right?
Right, and so you have to you have to be a really good marketer to do this, it seems like.
Even more sales jobs. Yep. One more on this one?
Well, one of the things that really strikes me is the geology of it, or the geography of it. There are some environments that really aren't positioned.
Totally.
To,
I agree completely.
okay.
Yeah. So I'm not advocating that everybody should build farm power.
No,
It's really unique to its locations, but
yeah.
it's a model of how you're doing it. And you're thinking about pig manure, I know already. No, sorry.
No, I'm thinking that the next thing they need to do is if they build it, it will will, or if you build it, it will come, and they need to put the digester and then sell off the farms around
Isn't
it
that interesting,
and
right?
make the digester
I have the lowest
incubator
cost
for the-
possible location to build a farm right next to my digester.
That's right.
Well, that's exactly what they did with the greenhouse in their second one. They built a pad that had a hydroponic heating in the pad because it was heated from the waste heat from the generator. And they said, anybody want to build a greenhouse? By the way, you can build a greenhouse here and you never have to buy natural gas. What do you want to put in it?
This is really quick personal. My dad did generators for digesters, but not these guys, but in Utah and some other places. But the methane was so caustic that it ate up the generator.
There've been issues around scrubbing the gas and working on what goes in order to make it come out better. Yeah.
Oh,
Good,
okay.
good.
Okay.
Little nuance of the game, but yes, definitely. What the heck is that? Just in case you weren't falling asleep, I decided to put this chart up just to see if I could. In your package, you'll find a book. It's a great new book by Kevin, I think it's a great new book by Kevin Wilhelm called Making Sustainability Stick. And if anybody wants one, we have some extra ones for sale as well. I'm not flogging them, but it's as a service. Since I drug them up here, you don't have to pay for shipping. So and of course, if you buy them, I don't have to carry them back. This book is brand new, and Kevin Wilhelm is based in Seattle. He's done some wonderful work with organizations like REI, Starbucks, and a number of other businesses. And it's a really good textbook, basically, on how to make some of this thinking work. Chapter 7 is this diagram, and Chapter 7 really talks about change management. A lot of this is really tuned, the assumption is that we're starting from an existing business that has to modify its behavior over to more sustainable thinking. You guys are unencumbered by that problem. See, I'm going to make your new startup an advantage instead of a disadvantage. You don't have to morph a changed mentality and work through an organizational change process. But if you did, this is a helpful diagram because it's really set up in phases of where a business is going, starting from conventional thinking in the first phase, all the way to a new way of doing business out in phase 5, where we really have figured out loops and we really have figured out how to be an ecosystem of businesses. Well, in the middle are some important change processes, and I think this chart does a really good service of, first of all, helping understand where you are kind of on the change process approach. Secondly, there's a million definitions of what sustainability means. In fact, I usually have to sit down with somebody for about 20 minutes, even if we actually have jobs like this, talk about what we're doing for about 20 minutes before we actually decide if we actually mean the same thing with the same words. How come? Well, it's because in each of these phases, you have the same words associated with different behaviors. So for example, in the first phase, conventional thinking, sustainability means green teams, recycling, some poor son of a gun down in the mailroom that's been trying to get me to recycle forever or ride a bike to work. And it's sort of random acts of greenness all over the place. I'm going to say they're heroes. They're more likely martyrs. All over the business, right? Trying to make a difference, carry the flag. It always costs more, right, to do these things. It almost always costs more to do them. And there's just general randomness in the whole approach. They tend to look more like the tree huggers and wackos than the people holding the next great business idea. In stage 2, really the next phase is when the organization has kind of made a shift and said, you know what, there's something to this. I think we should start a process around this. And now you have some process starting to do some metrics, and through this these phases, you go through these different approaches to what it's all about. People change, the emphasis in the business changes. There's a whole lot to this, Chapter 7. But what I wanted to put up here was just being able to understand some of the things that are going on. And I think the most important thing to note is there's this big blue line rising to the right called profit and value. Growth is not the enemy of sustainability. In fact, what if as Sally Julie used to say at REI, what if the bigger we got, the more good we could do? And the more good we did, the bigger we got. See, they're mutually reinforcing. The more you get one, the more you get the other. It's back to either or thinking. It's not we made money in spite of the fact that we did the right thing. It's we made money because we did the right thing. As Yvon Chouinard, the president of Patagonia, has always said, gee, I don't know. The more I did the right thing, the more money I made. It's easy for Yvon to say, right? Notice what's going on here. The brown curve is environmental and social negatives. They start rising, and in fact, for a little while, they're going faster than your growth of the business because it's actually getting worse before it gets better. It starts to top off when you've figured out some eco-efficiency kind of stuff, some of those really cool things where it turns out the happy coincidence was using less energy also cost me less money. Wasn't that cool? And so all of a sudden, the negatives start to plateau, and when you really get to some breakthrough innovations in the business, they actually start to go down. In 2012, REI grew again for I don't know how many years in a row, record profits, grew the business by 6 or 7%, and yet in 2012, year over year, greenhouse gas emissions of the entire co-op went down in absolute sense by 6%. So the growth was going that way, environmental impacts were going the other way for the first time in the company's history. You're not supposed to be able to do that. That's not supposed to work that way. We finally made it go. Now notice the green line. The green line is environmental and social benefits, the actual benefits that we have. Now we all have some benefits, even in phase one. We have employees. Right? Hopefully we're paying them well. Hopefully we give them benefits. So there's some benefits already. But as you grow in this work, what you start to realize is the more we have benefits, the more we're prospering. And in fact, doesn't that make sense in the end? Doesn't it make sense that a business that has environmental and social benefits should certainly be making more money than a business that has environmental and social consequences? In fact, ultimately, that's where business goes when it arrives in stage 5. So all that takes some new skills and competencies, things they didn't teach you in business school. So we're going to start right off with, for our entrepreneurs, starting with some of the new skills and competencies that I've noticed I think help make people successful in this. And by the way, if you're working in a big organization, my observation has been people who get this not only help create value in their organizations, but actually outperform their peers. People I've seen who gain these skills and competencies are getting promoted faster in their companies. And it's not just me saying so. Lee Scott, the outgoing or the former CEO of Walmart, noticed the same things about people in his organization. He said and he said it made complete sense in retrospect. And it wasn't that they were greener, it wasn't that they were kinder and gentler, it's that they were looking at the business different. They were adding value in a new way. And what he said was the skills and competencies that they had were executive leadership skills. They were able to, for example, think in systems, think in the whole picture, right? Not just think linearly. They were able to speak new metrics and new language, a new language of metrics in the organization. Because the contention is, my hypothesis is, environmental skills, environmental metrics, such as environmental and social metrics, are the key to being able to see our business in a new way. And they reveal risks and opportunities that we wouldn't have otherwise seen. Some new metrics, like being able to count carbon. Some new thinking, new tools like life cycle assessments, and some new skills around collaboration, both inside the business and outside the business. Being able to engage with NGOs, being able to work with academia, government, other businesses, and not just businesses in a linear, not my vendors and my customer. I know how to treat vendors. There's always a power conversation, and we say partnership all too often, and we never really mean that. We mean do what I tell you to do, right? What if you're working with two businesses that don't have a buy-sell relationship? They're just cohabitating in the same mall, but we have to get along so that we can get recycling to happen here. That's a whole new way to work, right? Whole new way to think about things, and something that, as small business folks, you often are more likely to be actually good at than corporate folks are. So collaboration is a whole new way of doing things, leading with influence instead of with authority. So a few resources. You get the copy of this so you can find it, and I'm only giving a few of them. The book has a ton of stuff. Check the back of the book. Lots and stuff. If you want to go to school, it's the place to go. But a few media things and a few collaborations that I think are really good. For example, I know there's some folks thinking about food here. So the Sustainable Food Trade Organization has some great resources and great folks. Packaging is a wonderful one, the Sustainable Packaging Coalition. Packaging, thinking about packaging in products is the gateway drug to sustainability. It's a great, it's a great way to think about things. Yeah, and it's a good thing. Now, how to capture some of this value. So my recommendation, my thinking is, start to think about how to capture some of this thinking about sustainable business thinking in ways that add some value to your operations. Look for some eco-efficiencies and start to capture some eco-efficient operational things right in your own stuff, right in your own business. It also is an opportunity to reduce some risks. You may have some exposures in your business that you don't see because, well, we're all conventional thinkers at the beginning. So actually poking into some holes and seeing some exposures might help you out down the road. Think about, and we're going to do an exercise about that in a second. And so rethinking your license to operate. What's the license to operate? Who gives you your license to operate? Customers? Who else? Don't say the state. I'm too Republican for that. Oh, sorry, this is on tape. How about your other stakeholders? How about if you're a dairy farmer, one of your license to operate is that the neighbors can tolerate the smell. Because eventually, if the neighbors can't tolerate the smell, they're going to figure out a way to make you stop doing what you do, even though they think it's really pretty and they think the cows are nice. If they can't tolerate the smell, sooner or later, they're going to make you stop doing what you're doing. My hometown, my family was one of the last dairy farms in the valley. Really sad thing. When you go to the local ag co-op and they're selling more lawnmowers than they are seed crop, it's a sad day for the farming in that community. Not that lawnmowers aren't a good thing, but yeah, so license to operate comes from a whole network of people around you, your neighbors, your other businesses, your customers. Someone has to give you permission to be successful. Think about that. Think about whose permission you're going to need to be successful and what's in it for them. Because if you can't answer that question, then you're probably thinking in terms of an older mindset where this is about competition and we're going to go crush those guys. Well, I'm not against competition. You do have to be pointed, penciled, and you have to be sharp. In fact, you have to be sharper than the next guy. However, thinking about collaboration and the network of support around you is really important when you think about how to get your business started and how to be successful. And finally, think about this from a value in the biggest picture. Think about this from a value proposition perspective. How do you really position yourself versus competitive approaches? My contention would be that businesses that create positive environmental and social consequences or side effects are actually going to outcompete not only their existing competitors, but they're going to outcompete new places. They're going to outcompete folks in replacing their businesses. So, for example, the coal-burning power plant might have seen the natural gas guy coming, but he never saw the dairy farmer coming. Right? You're gonna find new ways to attack incumbent solutions that they haven't even seen before. Finally, there's a bunch of corporations thinking about this. I didn't make it up, honest. There's some corporations that actually don't end up in the green news every day that are thinking about some of this stuff very, very deeply. GE now does billions of dollars of business in what they call their eco-imagination or their green initiatives. Unilever, Ben & Jerry's, Ben & Jerry's was bought by Unilever originally in the takeover. I'm not so sure how who ate whom, because today Unilever is one of the leaders in thinking about environmental and social responsibility in business. I'm not trumpeting them, but I'll tell you, Walmart's doing some amazing work, and they're having an amazing effect on folks. Just them caring makes a difference for an awful lot of folks. And the government, if you want to do business with the government today, it's amazing how much you can get when you're thinking about it from an environmental and social responsibility point of view. Some of you are thinking about green consumers, and I got to just make a couple of points about green consumers. They're a little tired. They're a little tired of this green message. They get a lot of it. So if you want to have a message to a green consumer, there's a few things I think are really important. One is credibility, authenticity. Authenticity is really important. Once you can fake that, you got it made. Think about materiality. Think if you're going to say that you've got if you're a coffee grower and you want to say it's shade grown, bird friendly, organic, fair trade, but don't say it's dolphin safe. Transparency is really important. Being able to see what you're doing and share information in a transparent way. Reporting is really a big deal. And think about that license to operate again. It's going to go back to essentially endorsements. Who's endorsing that you are who you say you are and you do what you say you do? It's not just your customer anymore. It's who's around you. It could be your employees. I think at REI, one of the things that I was always worried about is if there were gaps between what we said we did and what we really did, the first people that were going to be on the news was REI employees saying, it's not what's going on in my store, and here's proof. So the opportunity for transparency is, we had one vice president who would say very, very candidly, he would say, you can be transparent or someone will be transparent for you. So transparency is a pretty important issue. And finally, endorsements, as I mentioned. So recapping. So sustainable business. We're solving problems versus causing them. It's my way of saying it pretty easy. Right? And we're getting paid to do it. From linear thinking to systems or ecosystems thinking, from an either or to a both and, not accepting trade-offs, requires some new business skills and competencies that they didn't teach us necessarily in business school when they were telling us that I needed to be more aggressive. And environmental and social metrics are leading us into a place where they're exposing risks and opportunities that we didn't see about our business before. Here's another way of saying it. Starting to look through the lens of environmental and social responsibility is like giving everybody in your business night vision goggles. All of a sudden they see everything differently. And it's really neat. You go through some really interesting things. By the way, first, if you ever tried night vision goggles, first you trip and fall because it really takes a little getting used to. So that analogy holds. Then you start to see things differently and you start to go, oh, I can do this and I can do that. The final stage, you think about everything differently. It's like, you know what? I fight at night because the other guys can't see. So it changes your whole business strategy. Started changing your whole perspective about the way you do things. Fine, let's see, how am I going? So back to farm power. Thinking about that network of opportunities and thinking about that network of people. Now this is where I'm going to stop and break, and I'm going to look at the clock. Finally, breathe. We're doing okay. She says, fine, keep them here. Keep them. Make them suffer. It's boot camp. Make them hurt. All right, time to get you guys involved. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to do two pieces of exercise. First exercise is thinking about your business, thinking about your situation, and we're going to start thinking about what's this network look like for you. You're not going to get it right, and you're not going to finish it tonight. But just starting to think about it, think about what's this network of relationships look like for you. And I think, there we go. You might not find a form for this because I didn't know where yours was going to go. So take a blank piece of paper and just take a couple seconds. Start to think about, of course, your customer and of course your suppliers, but what are the rest of that network around you? Who are all those stakeholders or who are all those folks that you require to be successful or who are depending on you to be successful or don't want you to be successful? Let's have another color line for that one. Ready?